In the autumn of 1887, on a wind-scoured patch of prairie in the Nebraska sandhills, travelers saw something that made them pull their wagons to a stop. They saw a young man, not much more than a boy, digging a hole. Not a well, not a root cellar, a massive rectangular pit, shoveled out of the earth by hand, deeper than a man was tall. His name was Silas, and the people of Settlers' Outpost of Prosperity Creek thought he'd lost his mind. He was building a house, he'd told the few who asked, a home for himself and his new wife. They looked at the gaping hole, then at the sturdy log cabins dotting the valley, and they shook their heads. Some laughed. Most just felt a sad pity. And when the winter of 1888 hit with a fury that would be spoken of for 100 years, that crazy hole in the ground would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to see the number that made the county's best builders go silent, stay until the end. What did this quiet outcast understand about warmth, about wind, about the very ground beneath their feet that every seasoned frontiersman in the valley had missed? Let's find out. And while you're here, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and let me know where you're watching from. Silas wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. He was a 19-year-old orphan trying to stay alive. Kicked out of his uncle's home back in Ohio the day he turned 18, with little more than a strong back and a quiet disposition, he'd drifted west. He'd worked the silver mines in Colorado for a year, not as a miner, but as a timberman. His job wasn't finding the silver. It was making sure the earth didn't collapse on the men who did. He learned the language of soil. He understood pressure, load-bearing, and the immense, steady strength of the ground itself. He knew what kind of timbering could hold back 1,000 tons of wet earth. That was his transferable expertise, though he never would have used a fancy term for it. He just knew how to keep a hole in the ground from becoming a grave. He arrived in Prosperity Creek with $60 in his pocket and a quiet young woman named Alara, who he'd married a month prior. They bought a small, unwanted parcel of land on the north slope of the valley, the one nobody wanted because it got the full, brutal force of the winter wind. They put up a temporary shack. It was little more than a lean-to of green lumber and sod. By frontier standards, it was a start, but it wasn't a home. Their first winter, the winter of 1886, was a brutal lesson. The wind was a physical presence. It didn't just howl. It pressed against the thin walls, searching for every crack. It found them all. Silas burned through wood at a desperate rate, but the heat seemed to vanish the moment it left the stove. The cabin held a damp, penetrating chill that got into their bones. Alara stuffed rags along the baseboards every evening, only to find them frozen stiff by morning. Their water bucket, kept 2 feet from the stove, was a solid block of ice by dawn. They slept in all their layers, under every blanket they owned, and still woke up shivering, their breath pluming in the air. Silas would get up in the dark, his hands numb, and feed the stove, knowing that most of the heat was going straight up the chimney or being stolen by the relentless wind. He saw the toll it was taking on Alara, the constant shivering, the pale exhaustion. He watched the woodpile shrink with alarming speed. He started observing. He wasn't an academic, but he was a meticulous observer. He noticed how the snow drifted. He noticed how the wind scoured the north-facing walls of every cabin, but left the south-facing walls relatively calm. He watched the other settlers. He saw them hauling massive loads of cordwood. He heard them complaining at the trading post about the cost, the labor, the unending battle to stay 1 degree above freezing. They all fought the same enemy, the air. They were trying to heat the air in a leaky box, while the prairie wind worked tirelessly to replace it with Arctic cold. One morning, after a particularly brutal night, he was walking the property line. The wind was blowing a gale, a steady 40-mile-per-hour river of cold. He hunkered down behind a small rise in the land, a little dune of sand and prairie grass. The difference was immediate. The wind roared over his head, but in the lee of the rise it was almost still. The air was just as cold, but the feeling of cold was a fraction of what it had been out in the open. That's when the insight hit him. It wasn't a flash of genius. It was a simple connection between two things he knew. He knew from the mines that a few feet underground, the temperature was remarkably stable. It didn't freeze. It didn't bake. It stayed a constant cool temperature year-round. And he knew from standing behind that dune that the wind was a heat thief. The real enemy wasn't the temperature. It was the wind's ability to strip heat away. Wind doesn't just chill the air. It strips heat directly from walls through a process called convection. A 15-mile-per-hour wind can pull heat from a surface as effectively as if the temperature had dropped by 30 degrees. The settlers were building their cabins up in that river of wind. They were fighting the worst of it, head on. Silas looked at the ground. The answer wasn't to build a better box to fight the wind. The answer was to get out of the wind altogether. His plan formed, simple and radical. He wouldn't build on the land. He would build in it. He waited for spring, and when the ground thawed, he picked up a shovel and began to dig. The neighbors started to stare. The build began in late April. The materials were sourced with a pragmatism born of poverty. He wasn't buying milled lumber from the sawmill. He was using what the land offered and what his mining experience taught him. He marked out a rectangle, 20 feet by 30 feet. Then he began to dig. For weeks, that's all he did. He dug down 8 feet into the sandy loam. He moved the excavated earth to the north, east, and west sides of the pit, creating thick, sloping berms of soil that would rise above the eventual roofline. Only the south side was left open. This was patient, back-breaking work. Passers-by saw a young man disappearing into the earth one shovelful at a time. Once the pit was dug, he laid a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel he hauled from the creek bed a mile away. This was for drainage. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. His biggest challenge wasn't collapse. He knew how to timber for that. It was moisture. An underground house could easily become a damp, moldy tomb. The gravel bed was the first line of defense. Next came the timbering. He used cottonwood logs, which were plentiful but not considered prime building material. They were soft and prone to rot. But Silas knew they were strong enough if kept dry. He sank thick posts at the corners and along the walls, just as he would in a mine shaft. He built a thick central ridgepole beam to support the roof. The walls weren't solid logs like a cabin. They were framed-in retaining walls with heavy planking holding back the earth. He was meticulous about water. Before backfilling behind the plank walls, he layered in more gravel and even laid down sections of bark from fallen trees, creating a crude but effective French drain system that would channel any seeping moisture down to the gravel floor and away from the structure. He was building a boat inside the earth, designed to shed water. The physics of his design were simple but profound. The earth itself was his insulation. Below the frost line, which in Nebraska could be 4 or 5 feet deep, the ground maintains a steady temperature, roughly 50 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, all year long. His floor and 3 of his walls were touching this massive, stable thermal battery. They wouldn't be 50 degrees, but they would never get down to the minus 30 degrees the air outside would reach. The earth was doing most of the work for him. He left the south-facing wall completely exposed. This was his passive solar collector. He framed it for 2 large windows, using glass he'd carefully saved for. The low winter sun would stream through these windows, warming the interior. The thick earthen walls and floor would absorb that heat during the day and radiate it back slowly through the night. This is called thermal mass. A log cabin has very little. A house made of earth has an enormous amount. The roof was the most unconventional part. He laid heavy joists, covered them with thick planking, and then layered on tar paper he bought from the general store. On top of that, he put down a thick layer of sod, grass side up. The roof was a living part of the prairie. From a distance, in a year's time, his house would almost disappear into the landscape. Ventilation was the final piece of the puzzle. An airtight underground house is a recipe for stale air and condensation. Silas built 2 ventilation shafts, one low on the south wall for intake and one high on the back wall that extended up through the earthen roof like a squat chimney. This created a natural convective loop. Cool, fresh air would be drawn in, and warm, moist air would rise and exit. It was a simple, passive system that kept the air fresh and dry. By late summer, it was finished. From the outside, it looked bizarre. A sloping mound of earth with a single wooden wall and 2 glass eyes staring south. A stovepipe and a small ventilation shaft were the only things sticking out of the grassy roof. It looked more like a burrow than a house. Total cost, under $90. The glass for the windows was the biggest expense. The rest was timber. He cut himself hardware and tar paper. Hilara had been patient, but her anxiety showed. She'd helped him hauling dirt and fitting planks, but she couldn't ignore the whispers. One evening, as they stood outside the finished structure, she finally voiced her fear. "Silas, people are going to think we're prairie dogs." She kept her voice low. "They're going to think we've lost our minds." Silas looked at the dugout, then at her. He put an arm around her. "Let 'em," he said. It was one of the longest sentences she'd heard him speak all summer, and when neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw poverty. They saw desperation. They saw a man digging a hole because he couldn't build a proper house. The ridicule started before the first snow. The mockery didn't come all at once. It started as a low murmur and grew into a steady chorus of disbelief and scorn. The first to deliver a formal verdict was Jedediah Thorne. Thorne ran the sawmill and had built nearly half the cabins in Prosperity Creek. He was a man whose identity was tied to solid, right-angled construction. He saw himself as a bulwark against the chaos of the frontier, a builder of civilization. He came by in early October, ostensibly to see if Silas needed any milled lumber for the winter. He walked around the earthen mound, his face a mask of professional skepticism. He kicked at the bermed soil. He peered down the ventilation shaft. Finally, he stood before the south-facing entrance, arms crossed over his barrel chest. "Son," he began, his voice laced with the condescension of experience, "I see what you're trying to do, but you're fighting a losing battle." Silas just waited, his face impassive. "This ground holds moisture," Thorne declared, pointing a thick finger at the wall. "Come January, the frost will heave this whole bank of soil. It'll push your timbers in. If that don't get you, the damp will. You'll have mold on your walls, on your clothes. Your wife will get sick. This ain't a house, son. It's a root cellar, and a poorly designed one at that." Silas met his gaze. His response was quiet and level. "Just trying something different, Jedediah." Thorne snorted, a sound of pure dismissal. "There's a right way to build a house. This ain't it." He turned and walked back to his wagon, shaking his head. The expert had spoken. The public insult came a week later at the general store. Silas was there to buy a small supply of flour and salt. Gus Nolan, a loud, beefy man who worked as a teamster, saw him come in. Gus enjoyed having an audience, and Silas was an easy target. "Well, look what the gopher dragged in," Gus boomed, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. A few men chuckled. "Silas, I hear you ain't building a house so much as digging your own grave to save the undertaker the trouble." The laughter was louder this time. Silas didn't react. He gathered his goods, paid the clerk, and walked out. His silence was interpreted as shame. The nickname stuck. To many in the valley, he was now Gopher Silas. The gossip network took it from there. At the quilting circle, the women would ask Ilara with faux sympathy if she was getting enough light down in that hole. They'd offer her extra blankets, their pity a constant smothering presence. Conversations would stop when she entered a room. She was the poor girl married to the fool on the hill. Men riding past their property would slow their horses and stare, sometimes pointing. It became a local curiosity, a monument to one man's folly. The institutional skeptic arrived in November. He was Mr. Abernathy, the county extension agent. He was a man of manuals and government bulletins, a believer in modern scientific farming and building. He'd heard about Silas's structure and came to inspect it out of a sense of duty. He was polite but firm. He walked through the dugout, tapping the walls and making notes on a clipboard. "Mr. Evans," he said, his tone professional, "I admire the effort, but this is highly irregular. There are no building codes for a structure like this. The ventilation seems speculative. I have serious concerns about sanitation and air quality." He looked at Ilara, then back at Silas. "This isn't in any manual I've seen. I can't officially approve of it." The cut that went deepest, however, came from family. Ilara's older brother, Thomas, rode out from the main settlement. He was a practical man, a farmer who valued community standing. He took Silas aside while Ilara was inside. "Silas, I'm worried about my sister," he said, his voice low and earnest. This wasn't mockery, it was concern, and that made it worse. "She's a good woman. She deserves a proper home. People are talking. They're going to think you're either scared of the prairie or incompetent to build on it. Maybe both." He paused, letting the words sink in. "They think you're poor and foolish, and that reflects on her." Silas looked at the horizon, at the endless expanse of brown grass under a gray sky. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas," he said, his voice steady. "I'm trying to keep my family warm." Thomas just shook his head, convinced his brother-in-law was a lost cause. By the first snowfall in late November, not one person in Prosperity Creek thought Silas had solved anything. They thought he'd built a monument to his own strangeness, a testament to his failure to adapt to the realities of the prairie. He and Alara were utterly alone, isolated in their hole in the ground, waiting for the winter to pass its judgment. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Silas right. It changed how people in that valley thought about survival itself. Then December came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1888 is still recorded in Nebraska climatology archives as the Great Blizzard, a period of sustained, life-threatening cold and wind that broke records and broke spirits. It started gradually. December 8th, the thermometer at the general store dropped to minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. A bitter cold, but manageable. People just threw more wood on the fire. December 12th, it plunged to minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind picked up, a constant whining gale out of the northwest. The wind chill was a concept they understood in their bones, if not by name. It was a physical force that flayed the heat from any exposed surface. December 18th, the bottom fell out. The mercury read minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit at dawn. The wind was a steady 45 miles per hour. This created wind chills below minus 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It was a cold that killed. It was a cold that found its way through the tightest chinked logs. It was a cold that made metal brittle enough to snap. For 23 consecutive days, the thermometer in Prosperity Creek never climbed above zero. It was a relentless, grinding siege. The community began to break down under the strain. The suffering was specific and widespread. The Colby Ranch, a large, well-regarded operation, was burning through 2 cords of wood per month just to keep the main house at 42 degrees. Their cattle began to die, freezing to death in the sheds. Jedediah Thorne, the master builder, was working around the clock. His family was burning through their massive woodpile at an alarming rate. The logs in his properly built house were contracting in the cold, opening up tiny gaps. Frost was forming on the nail heads inside his walls, a sure sign that the cold was penetrating deep into the structure. Families with less firewood were in desperate situations. The Williams family, down by the creek, ran out of dry cordwood. They started burning green wood, which produced more smoke than heat. Their cabin was constantly filled with a hazy, choking smoke, and the temperature hovered in the high 30s. Their youngest child developed a wet, racking cough. Some began burning furniture, old chairs, chests, anything that would feed the stove for another few hours. Livestock froze in their barns. Wild animals were found frozen solid in the fields. The simple act of fetching water from a well became a life-threatening expedition. And then people started noticing the Evans place, or rather, what they weren't noticing. The first clue was the smoke from his stovepipe. On the coldest days, when every other chimney in the valley was belching a thick, constant plume of smoke from fires being stoked relentlessly, the smoke from Silas's pipe was a thin, lazy wisp. Sometimes, for hours at a time, there was no smoke at all. It was as if he wasn't even fighting the cold. A few brave souls who rode past on the main road saw something even stranger. On a day when the temperature was minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit, they saw Silas step outside his dugout for a moment. He wasn't wearing a heavy buffalo coat. He was in his shirt sleeves. He checked something on the roof, then went back inside. The sighting was dismissed as a trick of the light, an impossibility. No sane man would be outside in his shirt sleeves. The rumors started to shift. The mockery was replaced by a confused, fearful curiosity. What was happening in that hole in the ground? Were they even still alive in there? The lack of smoke was seen by some as a sign they had frozen to death. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It defied what they thought was possible. The vindication arrived on the morning of December 23rd. Jedediah Thorne was making rounds, a grim sense of duty compelling him to check on the families he knew were struggling. He loaded his sleigh with emergency cordwood, intending to drop some off for the poorest settlers. On a whim, driven by a nagging professional curiosity he couldn't shake, he decided to swing by the Evans place. He expected to find them either gone or frozen. He was prepared to find the worst. He pulled his horse to a stop before the mound of earth. The air was a brutal minus 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The wind cut like a razor. He wrapped his scarf tighter around his face, his breath freezing instantly on the wool. He walked to the wooden door, his boots crunching on the brittle snow. There was no smoke from the chimney. The place looked dead. He raised a heavy, gloved hand and knocked. After a moment, the door opened. It was Alara, and the warmth hit him. It wasn't a slight difference. It was like stepping into a different season. A wave of stable, comfortable, humid warmth washed over him, a stark contrast to the needle-sharp cold he'd been breathing for weeks. He was so stunned he couldn't speak for a moment. Alara stood there, not in a heavy coat and layers of wool, but in a simple cotton dress. Behind her, through the cabin opening, Thorne saw the image that would crystallize the moment for the rest of his life. He saw Silas sitting at a small table, mending a piece of leather harness. He was in his shirt sleeves, and on a rug on the floor, their infant daughter was playing, wearing nothing more than a light flannel gown. Not bundled, not shivering, playing. Thorne finally found his voice, stammering. "Alara, is everything all right?" He expected to hear a story of desperation, of a fire that had just been stoked to its limit. "We're fine, Jedediah," she said calmly. Her voice was steady. "We're managing fine. Would you like to come in?" It was her moment of agency, an invitation that was also a challenge. He stepped inside, pulling the door shut behind him. The interior was quiet. The small stove was barely ticking over, a low, gentle fire glowing within. It wasn't roaring. It wasn't being desperately fed. "I brought some wood," he said, gesturing vaguely toward his sleigh. "I was worried. No smoke." Silas looked up from his work. "Don't need it much," he said. "We're burning less than a quarter cord a week." Thorne stared at him. A quarter cord a week. It was an impossible number. "A quarter cord?" he repeated, his voice hollow with disbelief. "People are burning half a cord a week just to keep from freezing. The Colbys are going through 2 cords a month, and they can't get their house above 45. Silas didn't say anything. He just gestured with his head toward the wall. Hanging on a post was a simple mercury thermometer. Thorne, the builder, the man of measurements and facts, walked over to it. He squinted in the soft light from the window. The mercury sat clearly, undeniably, at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. 68 degrees. Let that sink in for a moment. It was 68 degrees inside the dugout. Outside, it was 36 degrees below zero. That was a temperature difference of 104 degrees. Thorne felt a wave of vertigo. It violated every rule he knew. He reached out and touched the packed earth wall. It wasn't icy. It wasn't even cold. It was cool to the touch, like a cellar wall in summer. He looked at Silas, then at the thermometer, then at the child playing comfortably on the floor. He couldn't process the data. It was impossible. He pulled out his own pocket thermometer, one he trusted. He hung it next to Silas's. They waited. 10 minutes later, it read the same, 68 degrees. The irrefutable data began to stack up in his mind, dismantling a lifetime of assumptions. The Colby Ranch, burning 2 cords of wood per month to hold 42 degrees Fahrenheit. The Williams cabin, burning half a cord a week to hold, maybe 38 degrees Fahrenheit. His own house, the best built in the valley, burning a cord every 10 days to hold 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Silas Evans's dugout, burning a quarter cord a week to hold 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. It was a different reality. Thorne stood there for a long time, the silence broken only by the quiet crackle of the stove and the soft gurgle of the baby. He looked at the thick timber posts, the dry plank walls, the ingenious ventilation. He saw it now not as a primitive whole, but as a sophisticated system, perfectly adapted to its environment. He saw the genius in getting out of the wind, in using the earth not as an enemy to be conquered, but as an ally to be embraced. He finally turned to Silas. His voice was raspy, stripped of all its earlier authority. He said the 2 words that signified a complete and total surrender of his worldview. I was wrong. He walked to the door, a changed man. As he opened it to the brutal, waiting cold, he paused and looked back at Silas. "We've been doing this wrong," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "For 50 years, we've been doing this all wrong." The system wasn't just about temperature. It was about human dignity. In that dugout, Alara cooked without shivering. Silas could work with his hands without them going numb. Their child slept through the night in a warm, safe room. The dugout turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. Word spread with the speed of a prairie fire. Thorne didn't hide what he'd seen. He was a man of facts, and the facts were undeniable. He told everyone. The numbers, 68 degrees on a quarter cord a week, became a legend in a matter of days. The mockery stopped overnight. It was replaced by a stunned, awestruck respect. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, returned a week after Thorne's visit. This time, he brought a calibrated thermometer and a notebook. He was no longer a skeptic. He was a documenter. He spent 2 hours with Silas, measuring the temperature in every corner of the house, noting the humidity, sketching the ventilation system. He meticulously recorded Silas's fuel consumption logs. Silas had kept detailed records, dates, outside temperatures, how much wood he used. This wasn't luck, it was engineering. Abernathy left shaking his head, muttering about thermal mass and geothermal stability. By the time the Great Freeze broke in mid-January, half the valley knew something impossible was happening on the North Slope, and they wanted to understand it. The adoption of the idea didn't happen because of a bulletin or a lecture. It happened because of desperation. The first convert was a man named Arthur Finch. The blizzard had taken 3 of his cattle and left his wife with a severe case of pneumonia. His cabin was drafty, his woodpile was nearly gone, and he was facing another month of brutal cold. He swallowed his pride and went to see Silas. He didn't ask for a handout. He asked for knowledge. Silas, true to his nature, didn't gloat or lecture. He walked Finch through the principles, the earth as insulation, the southern exposure for solar gain, the importance of drainage and ventilation. Finch didn't have time to dig a full dugout before the ground froze solid again. Instead, with Silas's guidance, he built a variation. He piled thick sod walls against the north, east, and west sides of his existing log cabin, burying it 3/4 of the way up. He banked earth against the foundation and packed it down. It was a simpler, cruder version, a hybrid, but it worked. Within a day, Finch was using half the firewood he'd been burning, and his cabin temperature rose by a stable 15 degrees. It was enough. It was the difference. That spring, the valley changed. 7 families dug out and built their own dugouts, with Silas quietly advising them all. 12 more followed by that summer. By the following winter, nearly 24 families in the region were living in earth-sheltered homes. They were warmer, safer, and spent a fraction of the time and money on fuel. They became known simply as Silas houses. Mr. Abernathy, the extension agent, published a bulletin the next year titled Practical Construction for the Prairie Climate. It featured detailed diagrams of Silas's dugout. It didn't mention him by name, referring only to a local innovator, but everyone knew. The bulletin spread across Nebraska and into the Dakotas. Variations appeared, adapted to different soil types and climates. What Silas built in 1887 out of necessity and quiet observation, anticipated by nearly a century what building scientists would later call passive solar design and earth-sheltered construction. He wasn't an inventor. He was a connector of old ideas. Mines had existed for thousands of years. Sod houses had been used by Vikings and prairie natives. He just saw the principles clearly and applied them correctly. Years later, when a traveler asked him how he came up with the idea, Silas was sitting on the grassy roof of his home, watching the sunset. He just shrugged. "This isn't new," he said. "The earth is warm. The wind is cold. It's just correct." The structure still stands, partially collapsed now, but still visible as a gentle depression in the land, a testament to a young man who listened to the earth instead of the crowd. The frontier didn't reward stubbornness or tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. It rewarded the quiet competence of a boy who was told he was digging his own grave, when in fact he was building the warmest, safest home in the county. What do you think? Drop a comment below. Where are you watching from? What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for more stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity every single week. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of survival techniques. The specific characters, names, and locations are fictional, created for narrative purposes. However, the engineering principles of earth-sheltered construction, passive solar design, and thermal mass are based on real historical practices and established building science.